The morning in Elkwood, Virginia, had the kind of chill that slid under doors and made the wooden floors creak in protest. Harper Lane was already awake before the first light broke over the Blue Ridge Mountains. She'd been up since 4, baking bread in the small, brick-lined ovens of her bakery, Sweet Hollow. It was a Tuesday, a slow season in winter, and most of the regulars wouldn't wander in until after the sun was fully up. She was shaping a loaf when the doorbell jingled, the sound sharp in the stillness. Harper glanced up from the counter, brushing flour from her hands onto her apron. A tall figure filled the doorway, framed by a gust of cold air. He was broad-shouldered, wearing a red and black flannel shirt under a weathered brown jacket. Snowflakes clung to the ends of his dark beard and melted slowly against his collar. "Morning," he said, his voice deep and steady, carrying the kind of quiet confidence Harper associated with men who'd grown up in the mountains. "Morning," she returned, curious. She didn't recognize him, and in a town as small as Elkwood, strangers always stood out. "What can I get for you?" He walked slowly toward the counter, scanning the shelves of fresh loaves, pies, and jars of jam. His boots made no sound on the old wooden floor. "Bread," he said finally. "Whole wheat, if you've got it." "Got it right here." She reached for the loaf still warm from the oven and wrapped it in brown paper. "Anything else?" "Tea," he said, eyes meeting hers briefly before drifting back to the display. "Chamomile." "2 boxes." Harper pulled the tea from a shelf and set it beside the bread. "That'll be $8.50. He nodded, pulling out a folded stack of crisp 20s. He laid a bill on the counter, but instead of stepping back, he looked at the bread and tea again, then at her. "Actually," he said, "I'll pay for a week's worth." "Same bread. Same tea. I'll come by every morning to pick it up." Harper blinked, surprised. No one in Elkwood ever paid in advance unless they were setting up for a wedding or holiday event. "You must really like chamomile," she said lightly, trying to keep the conversation casual. A faint smile tugged at the corner of his mouth. "Not really," he admitted. "But I think I'll like stopping by here." The way he said it wasn't flirtatious exactly, it was quieter than that. More a broken bar matter of fact, like a truth he didn't feel the need to dress up. Harper wrote down his name in the order book, Elijah Boone. His handwriting, when he signed, was careful and deliberate. Over the next few days, Elijah came in at the exact same time, at 7:15 a.m. Like the ticking of a clock. Always with snow in his hair, always wearing the same flannel under his jacket. Some mornings, his beard was damp from the melting frost. Other mornings, he carried the faint scent of pine and wood smoke. On Wednesday, he asked how business was in winter. She told him it slowed down, but she didn't mind a winter gave her time to try new recipes. On Thursday, he brought in a jar of blackberry jam he said his neighbor made, and when Harper thanked him, he shrugged as if gifts were nothing worth talking about. By Friday, she noticed something unusual. Elijah didn't pull out his phone, didn't glance at the clock, didn't seem in a rush to leave like most of her customers. He lingered, not in an awkward way, but as though the quiet of the bakery was a place he could rest for a moment before stepping back out into the cold. Harper, who was used to the chattiness of locals and the hurried pace of passers-through, found herself wondering about him. Did he live deep in the mountains? What did he do for work? Why was he alone? She didn't ask. There was something about him that made questions feel like trespassing. Saturday morning brought the first real storm of the season. Snow fell heavy and fast, blanketing Main Street before the plows could pass. Harper almost didn't open, thinking no one would come in. But at exactly 7:15, the bell above the bakery door rang, and Elijah stepped inside, brushing snow from his shoulders. "You made it," she said, unable to hide her surprise. "Told you I'd be here," he replied simply. He took his bread and tea, paid, and stood for a moment by the window, looking out at the snow. "Road's a mess," he said. "Town'll probably shut down by noon." "You should be careful driving back," Harper said. He gave a small nod, and for a moment, Harper thought he might say more. Instead, he thanked her and stepped back out into the swirling white. She watched him go, his boots leaving deep tracks in the unplowed street. Sunday morning was quiet again, the storm having passed but leaving behind a layer of ice that glittered in the weak sunlight. Harper had just pulled a tray of scones from the oven when the doorbell rang. Elijah was there, same as always, but something about his expression was different. He looked Thomas to Broken Bar hesitant. "You're here early," she said, glancing at the clock. It was only 7:05. He set his gloves on the counter. "I figured I'd get a head start today." His eyes shifted to the shelves, then back to her. "You ever been up in the high ridge trails?" "Not in winter," Harper said. "Too icy for me." "Fair enough," he said with a faint smile. "I go up there sometimes." "Brings you above the fog. You can see for miles." There was a pause, a space in which Harper thought he might invite her to go sometime. But instead, he took his bread and tea, thanked her as always, and left. She was beginning to think that maybe that was all there was to Ida, a quiet man with a weekly order and a habit of showing up on time. But something about the way he lingered on Sunday stayed with her, even after the door closed and she was alone again with the scent of fresh bread. Monday would change everything. At exactly 7:15, the bell rang one last time for the week. Elijah stepped in, not only carrying the usual bread and tea but holding a small paper bag tied with twine. His boots were wet with melting snow, and his breath came in clouds as he crossed the bakery floor. "You're early," Harper said again, though she didn't mean the words in a literal sense. Something about him felt a Broken Bar early. On the edge of saying something he'd been keeping to himself. He set the paper bag on the counter. "For you," he said simply. Inside was a jar of wildflower honey, the kind that came from small batch hives deep in the mountains, thick, golden, and fragrant. Harper lifted it from the bag, surprised by the weight and warmth of the glass. Before she could speak, Elijah cleared his throat. His eyes held hers with a steadiness that made her heart skip. "I've been up here in these mountains for years. Don't talk to many folks. But this week a Broken Bar I kept finding excuses to see you. So I brought my heart too, if you'll take it." The room felt impossibly still, the smell of fresh bread mingling with a sharp scent of snow clinging to his jacket. Harper didn't move at first, caught between the steady hum of the ovens and the rush of something warm rising in her chest. She finally smiled, small but certain. "I think," she said, her voice soft as the snow falling outside, "I just might." Elijah's shoulders eased, and for the first time, she saw the quiet relief in his expression. He picked up his bread and tea, nodded once, and stepped out into the cold again, but this time, Harper knew he'd be back. The next morning, the mountains woke under a pale wash of winter light. The storm had passed 2 days ago, leaving the world hushed and bright, every branch outlined in frost. Harper stood in the bakery before dawn, the ovens glowing amber, the air rich with the scent of rising bread. But her mind wasn't on the dough in her hands, it was on the man who had left her with a jar of wildflower honey and a sentence she couldn't stop replaying. She had placed the jar on the shelf behind the counter, right where she could see it every time she looked up. It wasn't just honey, it was the way he'd said the words, the honesty tucked inside them. In a town where people often spoke in polite half-truths, Elijah Boone had given her something plain and unvarnished. It was the sort of thing that left a mark. When the doorbell rang at exactly 7:15, Harper's heart jumped in a way she wasn't proud of. She wiped her hands on her apron and turned. There he was, the same flannel, same snow-dusted beard, same steady presence. But today, his smile was warmer, as though something unspoken now sat between them and neither of them minded. "Morning," she said, feeling a strange mix of ease and nerves. "Morning," he returned, stepping to the counter. "Bread and tea, same as always." She wrapped the loaf and boxed the tea, sliding them across the counter. "And the honey," she added with a teasing tilt of her head, "was perfect?" "Thank you." His eyes softened. "Glad you liked it." "My hives are up past Deer Creek. Took a while to get a good batch this year." "You keep bees?" she asked, genuinely surprised. "Among other things," he said. "Winters are slow for most of my work, so the bees keep me busy." Harper wanted to ask what other things meant, but she sensed he wasn't a man who offered all his answers at once. Instead, she nodded, holding his gaze a second longer than she meant to. "Well, you might have ruined store-bought honey for me forever." "That wouldn't be the worst thing," he said, his mouth curving into a small smile before he took his order and left. The week unfolded in quiet rhythms. Elijah came every morning, never missing a day, always on time. Some days they spoke about the weather, some days about food, and once he told her about a bear that had wandered too close to his property in summer. She laughed at the way he described chewing it off with nothing but a bucket and a stubborn voice. Harper found herself looking forward to those 10-minute conversations more than she wanted to admit. It wasn't just that he was handsome in that rugged, mountain-born way, it was the steadiness he brought with him, the sense that he wasn't rushing toward the next thing. She'd dated before him men from town, a few from the city, but they'd always seemed distracted, half-present. Elijah, on the other hand, gave his full attention to the moment, as if there was nowhere else he needed to be. One Thursday, just as she was closing for the day, the bell jingled unexpectedly. She turned to see Elijah, his jacket zipped against the cold, a faint flush on his cheeks from the wind. "You're late," she teased. "Or early for tomorrow?" "Neither," he said, setting a small paper bag on the counter. "Thought you might like this." Inside was a loaf of sourdough, but not hers, his. The crust was darker than hers, the scoring on top deep and precise. "You bake?" she asked, surprised again. "Sometimes," he said. "My grandmother taught me. Figured it was fair to trade bread for bread." She smiled, the warmth in her chest expanding. "I think I can make room on the shelf for this." He lingered a moment longer than usual that evening. They spoke about recipes and rising times, about the way the cold slowed yeast. Then, without much ceremony, he tipped his head in goodbye and stepped back into the darkening street. Days turned into weeks, and though Harper never asked, she started to piece together fragments of his life. He lived in a cabin up on the ridge, tended bees, cut timber, and sometimes did repair work for the Park Service. He had no family nearby. He didn't say much about the past, but when she mentioned losing her mother a few years ago, his quiet nod told her he understood loss more deeply than he let on. It was late February when he broke the pattern. Instead of bread and tea, Elijah ordered coffee. Harper arched an eyebrow as she poured it. "Everything all right?" she asked. "Yeah," he said, though his voice was quieter. "Just a broken bar, thinking I might try something different today." They stood there in the warm hush of the bakery, the only sounds the hum of the ovens and the faint clink of his spoon against the mug. "Different is good," she said. "Sometimes," he agreed, looking at her with a seriousness that made her pulse quicken. "Other times, you find something worth keeping the same." Before she could decide what to say, the door opened and two locals came in, stamping snow from their boots. Elijah finished his coffee, left his payment on the counter, and slipped out without another word. That night, Harper thought about his expression, the weight in it. She wondered if he was working his way toward something or if she was imagining it entirely. The answer came the following Saturday. The morning was unremarkably clear skies, light frost, the scent of cinnamon rolls in the air until Elijah walked in carrying not just his order, but a small wooden box. It was carved with a simple mountain scene, the grain polished smooth. "This is for you," he said, placing it on the counter. Harper opened it to find a jar of honey, a loaf of his sourdough, and a folded note. "I don't usually write things down," he said, looking faintly uncomfortable. "But I figured I'd better, in case I got the words wrong saying them out loud." She opened the note slowly. The handwriting was careful, like each letter mattered. "Harper, you've made this winter something I didn't know I needed. I can't promise more than the truth, but I'd like to see where it could go. I brought my heart too, if you'll take it." When she looked up, he was watching her, still and steady. "You mean it?" she asked softly. "I do," he said. Outside, a breeze stirred the frost from the awning, sending it scattering like sugar. Inside, Harper felt a warmth that had nothing to do with the ovens. She reached for the box, then for his hand. "I think," she said, echoing her words from that first day, "I just might." From that morning on, things shifted subtly at first. He stayed longer, helping her bring in flour sacks or fix the stubborn back door that never quite latched. Some afternoons, when the bakery was quiet, she'd close early and they'd walk down to the river, boots crunching over the frozen ground. By March, Harper had learned the winding road up to his cabin, the smell of pine and wood smoke that always hung in the air there. She'd seen his hives, rows of weathered boxes painted in soft greens and blues. She'd sat at his grandmother's old table, sipping tea while snow fell outside. Spring was slow to arrive in Elkwood, but when it did, the mountain laurel bloomed in soft bursts of pink and white. The air warmed, the bees grew busy again, and Harper realized that what had started as a week's worth of bread and tea had turned into something far richer. She never asked why Elijah had walked into her bakery that first morning. Maybe he just needed bread and tea. Maybe he'd already been looking for something more. But she knew that every morning since, she had looked forward to the sound of the bell, the sight of snow or rain, or sunlight caught in his beard, the steady way he looked at her as though she were worth showing up for. And every time he handed her payment, she thought of that first jar of honey, the one still sitting on her shelf, empty now but too precious to throw away. Because it wasn't the honey she remembered, it was the heart he'd brought with it, and the way she'd known, almost instantly, that she would keep it.